Hi, welcome to the channel. I'm Ron. Today I'm going to be trying to add a little new feature to the channel. It's going to take me a bit outside my comfort zone, but I'm going to try anyway. If you've been here before, first of all, thanks for coming back. You know that I'm a musician by trade, and that this channel is about my music making in general, and especially my main instrument, Native American flute. But for me, books and literature have always been a close second to music, and so, of course, I'm especially interested in all our wonderful writers who are indigenous people of the Americas and of the Pacific Islands. Now, I do watch a bit of BookTube, and I've seen a number of tags recently that no matter what the focus, they're structured pretty much the same way. A lot of times they'll have 25 prompts, and usually there will be one prompt that sounds something like this. Read one book by an author who is a person of color or indigenous. Now, I'm not going to call anybody out by name here. These are people that I subscribe to, and I like their work, I admire their work, and I respect them. They're bright. I know they mean well. But here's the thing. The way these tags are structured, apparently you could read up to 25 books, and as long as just one of those books is by a writer who is not from the dominant culture, then, here is your diversity sticker. A lot of these people are literature majors and English majors. I know that they know the difference between real diversity and abject tokenism. And I can say from my own experience that our institutions of higher learning, especially in the humanities, remain incredibly Eurocentric. So I've decided to believe that the real problem here is that there's still a lot of people that just simply don't know how many great books have been written by people who are indigenous folks from the Americas and the Pacific Islands. So even though I'm just a lowly and rapidly aging flute player, I'm going to try to help out a little bit. I'm not looking to be a full-time booktuber. I'm just trying to get the word out about some of our writers. And so I'm going to do what little bit I can. Let's get started. We're going to start with one of my favorite collections of traditional cultural stories. It's called The Telling of the World, and it was compiled by W.S. Penn, who is himself a Native American and teaches Native American literature at Michigan State University. There are a lot of things that I really love about this collection, starting with the fact that not only is it stories, but it has a lot of very beautiful prints of artwork by contemporary Native American artists, kind of like what you see here on the cover, some really stunning pieces. And then there are also some wonderful photographs of artifact crafts pieces from various cultures. Many different cultures represented here. It's laid out kind of in life cycle ways. So it starts with creation stories, then moves on to stories about adolescence and love and family, and then on to elders and the wisdom of elders, and then finally, how do we understand death? Another thing that I really love about this collection is how it was put together. All of the stories here are told by people from the cultures, and in many cases they were made from recordings and then translated or in some way adapted so that they could be put into print and shared with a broader public. So it's a really beautiful and valuable collection, and a great way to start getting introduced to the worldview of Native American peoples and the broad range of stories that come from different traditions. Now, when our literature major friends say that they are reading classical literature, they almost always mean that they are reading the ancient writings of Greece and Rome, because those cultures are considered to be the foundational cultures of Europe, and that's the focus of most of our literature programs. But these are our foundational stories. Here in the Americas, we're really too diverse to trace our literary traditions back to just one or two places. The reality is that we have many hundreds of cultures throughout the hemisphere, and each of them has its own foundational literature of creation stories, wisdom stories, trickster stories, all kinds of stories that tell us who we are as a people and how we are to relate to each other and to all of the other wonderful beings that we share this world with. Look at the title again here. It says, The Telling of the World. Now, there was writing in the Americas before the Europeans got here, but really we tend to tell our stories more than write them down. So one way you can get a little bit closer to that, these are short stories for the most part. Read them out loud, right? And you'll get a little bit closer to the way our foundational literature would have been shared traditionally. Also, no matter where you are in the Americas, there's probably an indigenous community living close by or even all around you without you even knowing it. And many times, you can check your local events calendar. They will be putting on cultural festivals or powwows, and the general public often is invited for at least part of that. And many, many times, there will be a traditional storyteller on hand telling some stories from the local people. This is a really, really great way to honor the people on whose land you are living, is to listen to their stories. And you can often do that live and in person. And it takes you one step closer to experiencing the foundational literature the way it would have been shared. Also, the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. has a YouTube channel. And sometimes storytellers will be there, and sometimes there will be artists telling how their work relates to their identity and to their people. I've had the honor of being a featured artist at that museum and have played there many times. It's a beautiful, beautiful facility, and they do a really great job, a lot of good and valuable work, and you can see some of it right here on YouTube. Let's move on to a couple of novels. The first one, I think, can safely be considered a modern classic. It is James Welch's Winter in the Blood. Now, the great Louise Erdrich has written an introduction for this edition, and I'm going to share just a little bit of that with you because she says this much better than I ever could. In 1974, no fiction award was given for the Pulitzer Prize, but it should have gone to the book you are holding. Winter in the Blood was and still is a central and inspiring text to a generation of Western regional and Native American writers, including me. More than that, Winter in the Blood is a quiet American masterwork. That it was overlooked for the prestigious prizes of its year only speaks of its visionary simplicity and the raw depth of the heart that wrote it. It's a coming-of-age tale and is told in first person. Set in modern times, but this young man's family and his people have really been shattered by the experience of settler colonialism. And he's on a very, very dark and self-destructive path. But over the course of the book, he has some experiences that allow him to examine that and maybe look for a way out of the darkness. So it's a short book, as you can see. So it's a good place to start. You can really get a sense of one of our great modern master writers and the worldview that he has. I know that there are some of you out there that really like your Penguin Classics edition, so I would like for you to notice that this is a Penguin Classics Black Spine edition, right? So now you know about it. You can add it to your classics collection. Right, the other novel I have for you today is epic fantasy. Now, I don't read much epic fantasy. I don't have any Tolkien on my shelves. I read it long, long ago when I was in high school, and believe me, that was long, long ago at this point. And I've never felt a strong urge to pick it up ever again. And C.S. Lewis, frankly, just irritates me. So not much epic fantasy on my shelves, except I got a hold of this recently, and I can't get enough of it. Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is about 450 pages long. I think I have about 80 pages to go, and I'm already like, must have sequel. But I don't think the sequel hits until next year sometime, so I'm just going to have to wait. Now, I think the reason that I'm loving this as epic fantasy when I've never really been much interested in epic fantasy is that this is epic fantasy that's coming out of foundational stories of the Americas. Right, in this case, Mesoamerica. So there's a lot of Mayan and Aztec stuff here. And there are several places along the way where I've found myself going, yeah, that is so indigenous. Or, yeah, that's exactly what an Indian character would say. That's just really, really excellent. So I'm just really vibing with this on all kinds of levels. And I got to say, I really love it when I see a character or some kind of animal or figure or being that's clearly modeled on a figure I know from traditional story, because I'm not from the Mesoamerican cultures, but there's a lot of overlap with my own culture. And so I recognize the energies, I recognize the beings, and I'm really connecting with this on a lot of levels. It's wonderfully, wonderfully written. And I would recommend it highly, even if, like me, maybe you're not especially into epic fantasy. Let's look at some poetry next, because, oh my goodness, do we have some poets. The first title is very, very long, so excuse me, I'm going to read it to you and then I'll show it. When the light of the world was subdued, our songs came through. A Norton anthology of Native Nations poetry looks like this, and it is a Norton anthology. It is substantial, and of course Norton anthologies also strive to have academic integrity, and all of the editors here are scholars in addition to being poets. It's laid out geographically, so we have regions, mostly through the continental United States, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But there's a region called Northeast and Midwest, for example, and there's one that's called Pacific Northwest, Alaska, and Pacific Islands. And for each of these regions, there is an editor who is from one of the cultures within that region, and they've written a very sensitive essay introducing the poetry from that region. The lead editor here could not have been better chosen. Joy Harjo is an absolute institution in Native American poetry. A number of her collections could already be considered classics. She is a poet laureate of the United States, the first Indigenous person to serve in that capacity. So she is the obvious and perfect choice, and she provides a wonderful introductory essay for the collection as a whole. Now, one of the things she talks about in that essay is inclusion and identity. Who did they consider for this, and who did they not consider? And it's actually in there that I have a bit of a quibble, well, maybe actually a major quibble with what's been done here. And the key term here is Native Nations. If you look at any political map of the Americas and you see all these boundary lines, like state boundaries in the United States and international boundaries and all of that, none of those boundary lines were drawn by Indigenous people. So, for example, we have a number of communities that have people living on both sides of the U.S.-Canada border, or both sides of the Rio Grande River, which, after all, for tens of thousands of years, was just a river, and it still isn't all that hard to get across if you really want to. All right, so when I think of Indian country, I think of the entire hemisphere, not just the United States. Right? And even within the United States, we have a number of different types of Native American communities. Now, we're not going to get in this too deeply here. It's not the place to do that. But we have a number of cultures who have treaty agreements with the United States government. People call them the federally recognized tribes. We have communities that have agreements with the states where they live. So the state recognized tribes. And then we have communities that have been on the same land that their ancestors were when the Europeans first showed up, but don't really have any formal recognition at either the state or the federal level. Now, the key idea here under Native Nations, and Harjo addresses this a bit in her introduction, is that they want to make sure that people who are claiming to be Native American poets actually are Native American, actually are from indigenous communities. And I think that's a legitimate, a valid concern. But in the process, a lot of people kind of got left out. Joy Harjo and all of the editors here are members of cultures who have treaties with the United States federal government. And so the included poets in the anthology tend to be very heavily weighted towards those kinds of communities. There's very little representation, for example, of First Nations peoples from Canada. There's very little representation from south of the Rio Grande River. There are a couple of poets here whose communities have kind of gone through this rebuilding experience, and then the state they were living in made an agreement with them, and maybe even eventually the federal government did. right? So they've kind of been through many levels of recognition. So identity and all of that kind of stuff can become very, very complicated and very contentious. So, I would really love to have seen more inclusion in this volume, but I understand why it ended up the way it did. And even as it is, even, with that somewhat major quibble, it's a magnificent place to start if you're interested in getting a sense of how many wonderful poets we have. There is very, very good representation of different cultures throughout what's now the United States. There's very good balance in gender and in orientation and sexuality. There obviously is an understanding that for most of our cultures, traditionally, notions of gender and sexuality and how we express that's always been rather fluid anyway, and that's certainly reflected in the poets that have been included in this volume. So have no complaints whatsoever that way. There are an enormous number of poets, I think more than 160. The earliest poem included here is from the late 1600s, and then it goes all the way through the boarding school experiences and all the way up to poets, in some cases, whose first publications came just a few years before the anthology was made. So it really is a magnificent collection, and even though I have concerns about who got included and who didn't, I can't recommend it highly enough as a starting place for getting acquainted with a vast variety of our wonderful Indigenous poets. One of the editors from that anthology, who contributed in the Pacific Islands region, is Brandi Nalani McDougall. And so we're going to look at just one kind. This was really, really hard because there's so many poets I wanted to include here, but I'm going to include her volume, Salt Wind. This was published in 2008, and it is her first collection of poetry. Most of our younger writers have been educated in institutions of higher learning, right, that have those Eurocentric biases that I was talking about. So they really understand the European literary tradition extremely well, along with their own people's foundational literatures. And a lot of, especially our younger writers, are looking for ways to resist, to answer back a little bit. And one way that McDougall does this is to include a lot of Kanaka Maoli language in her poetry. So there's a lot of it, and there's a lot of reference to traditional stories, traditional creation stories, traditional mythic characters, all coming out of Kanaka Maoli culture, without any translations, right? Without any footnotes. Okay, so I did find that Google Translate does a fairly good job with Kanaka Maoli, but put in Hawaiian, by the way, in Google Translate. You say you're going from Hawaiian to English, and then it will do a reasonably good job. And by the time I got to the end of the book, I ended up with a nice handwritten glossary of Kanaka Maoli terms. This is really, really beautiful, beautiful, moving poetry. I think I've read it 3 times now, and each time I can go just a little bit deeper as I remember more of the Kanaka Maoli terms as I go along. So check it out. The last 2 books I have for you today are interesting to me because rather than just being a novel or poetry or a memoir, apparently the writer decided, hey, I've got a story to tell and I'm going to use any and all means necessary to tell the story well. The first one is actually by one of my favorite musicians on the planet. And when I found out she had written a book, I had to go check it out. And then when I read it, I had to spend a little time being envious that apparently some people get all of the skills. But after that, I decided that, if you want to start talking about creative forces on the planet right now that are Indigenous people, I really think you'd have to put Tanya Tagaq on the short list. This is her book, Spirit Tooth. The hardback version came out in 2018 and basically looks the same with the colors reversed, but I really kind of like the look of the paperback edition here. I like paperbacks anyway. Now, this is another coming-of-age story, this time a young woman growing up in the 1970s in Canada, because Tanya Tagaq is First Nations Inuit. She is a throat singer when she's being a musician, and an amazing throat singer, and also kind of an experimental electronica musician. So you really do need to check her out. See, I couldn't help myself. I had to talk about her music a little bit. There are a lot of good music videos of her work here on YouTube. So just put Tanya Tagaq into your browser and see what all comes up. But here we have a young woman growing up in the 1970s in Canada. And just like we were talking about with James Welch earlier, her community has really been shattered by colonial settlerism, and she's trying to work through all of the difficulties of her existence. I'm going to share with you just a little bit of the synopsis on the back, because it'll give you a little bit of insight into Tagaq's writing style as well. A girl grows up in Nunavut in the 1970s. She knows joy and friendship and the love of her parents. She knows the tedium of the everyday world and the raw, amoral power of the ice and sky, the seductive energy of the animal world. She knows the ravages of alcohol and violence at the hands of those she should be able to trust. She sees the spirits that surround her and the immense power that dwarfs all of us. Right, just a brief time out here. When we see things like this, she sees the spirits that surround her. A lot of times, dominant culture readers will see something like that and think, oh, this is magical realism. This isn't magical realism. This is real, right? This is how you can experience the world if you are deeply connected to it. Just because Western science hasn't figured out how to measure it yet, that doesn't mean that it's magic or supernatural somehow, or that this is magical realism. All right. Split Tooth moves effortlessly between fiction and memoir, myth and reality, poetry and prose. Tagaq conjures a world and a heroine readers will never forget. Well, I have to agree with that entirely. If you've never read any Indigenous literature before, but you really like things like Daniel Woodrell's Winter's Bone, I think you might connect with this pretty well. I'd also like to share just a little bit of a review from Quill and Quire, because I think it really gets the general gutsiness of this writing really well. Like a smirking teenager, Split Tooth blithely gives typical literary expectations the finger, daring us to see and experience narrative as chaotic, emotional, and deeply instinctive. And it succeeds. Yes, it most certainly does. A while back, I was invited to play Native American flute at a Papal Mass in Washington, D.C., of all things. And that went well enough that a few years later, I was invited to play for another Papal Mass, also in Washington, D.C. This time, I turned the Pope down. Now, I've written a blog about both of those experiences, and if you want to get the details, you can check it out at my website, ronwarrenmusic.com. The reason I turned down the second invitation was I discovered that at that Mass, the Pope was planning to canonize Junipero Serra. Serra started the California mission system, and it was incredibly destructive. For me and for a lot of Indigenous people, it would be more appropriate for Serra to be tried posthumously for crimes against humanity. Forget making him into a saint. And if you read the first few chapters of this last book I'm showing you today, you'll understand why. It's called Bad Indians, and it's by Deborah Miranda. Now, Deborah Miranda is from one of the California indigenous cultures that were totally destroyed between the Spanish mission systems, the California government, and the United States federal government. There are entire cultures of indigenous Californias that literally are extinct now, and many others suffered cultural genocide. And that's kind of what Miranda's getting at here when she subtitles this a tribal history. So here we have personal memoir, we have family history, we have tribal history. There are short stories, retellings of cultural stories, discussions of language issues, poems, snarky cartoons, whatever she needs to do to get this story across. Another thing that really comes through here that she talks about in some detail, and I think it's a very, very important concept, is the idea of intergenerational trauma that exists not just for families and individuals, but also for entire cultures. and how long and hard the process is to begin to recover and move back towards a more positive path. You really get a sense of the endless struggle her people have gone through and the continual nonstop work that is still happening to recover their identity, their cultural history, and their language. She speaks very eloquently at times of some of those issues I was mentioning when we were talking about the Harjo poetry, the Norton Anthology collection. There are places where she wonders, am I less of an Indian if my people don't have federal recognition, if I don't have a federal identification card in my pocket? So these are very, very real issues for a lot of people, and she speaks to them very eloquently. At the same time, we are also a people of hope. And so her joy and her sense of humor come through in equal measure. So it's a really, really important book to get a hold of. I think it will give you a lot of insight. American history is usually presented a particular way by dominant culture history books. And it's important to understand that, during the supposedly great westward expansion, there were an awful lot of people facing east wondering just what the hell was going to hit them next. And so this is an opportunity to get some of the other side of the story. Thank you, Robbie. Well, those are the books that I have for you today. Like I said, this is my first time talking about books on this channel. I'm kind of outside my comfort zone, so I appreciate you sticking this out. If you've read any of the books that I talked about today, let me know in the comments section. Let me know what you thought about them. If there's anything you'd like for me to talk more about next time, or if you have any questions, please let me know about that too. And I hope that as I go along, I will get a little bit better at this also. Starting next month, I'll have a slightly different schedule on my channel, like I've had a schedule before. The first and third Fridays of the month will still be about music, but the fourth Friday of each month, I will bring you more books by Indigenous writers from the Americas and the Pacific Islands. So again, thanks for checking this out, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.